Welcome everyone. My name is Megan Brotherton from the Australian Safe Communities Foundation, and along with Tanya Peters from Safe Communities Foundation New Zealand, we're your hosts for this webinar. Before we start, just a couple of little housekeeping matters. We have three great presenters today who will have around 15 minutes each for their presentations. We'll also have time for a couple of questions after each presentation. Each participant has access to the GoToWebinar control panel on your screen, like the little picture there. If you're having any problems, please send a message to the organisers via the control panel and we'll endeavour to resolve the issue. If you'd like to ask a question during the presentations, please type your question in the question area on the control panel, or you may wish to put your hand up. To put your hand up, please click the yellow hand on the control panel. If your question isn't answered, the presenters will provide an email address at the end of their session for you to correspond with them personally. The webinar will be recorded and will be available for viewing early next week. So our first presenter today is Annette Boutrace. Annette is Adjunct Professor, School of Health Sciences at the University of Canterbury, Christchurch, and Suicide Prevention Coordinator, South Canterbury District Health Board. Annette is presenting on rural communities, mental health and suicide.
Thank you very much, Megan, and welcome everyone. In the brief time that I have available, I'm going to talk about current concerns about suicide in rural areas, rural suicide prevention, mental health services in rural areas, the current state of rural mental health in New Zealand, and future directions. Just by way of providing a background, I want to talk about the current political issue of rural suicide, although it's actually referred to as more commonly as farmer suicide in New Zealand. Politically, this is an issue, became an issue in the middle of last year when people became concerned about the impact of the global dairy crisis in 2015, along with weather events. Some areas in New Zealand have current droughts. And so the political response to this was that the Ministry of Health and the Ministry of Primary Industries, responsible for agriculture in New Zealand, jointly made available emergency funding of $500,000, and the Ministry of Health used its allocation of funding to contract the Rural Health Alliance Aotearoa New Zealand, which is an organisation of more than 40 organisations involved in various aspects of rural health. The Rural Health Alliance was subcontracted to run rural suicide prevention workshops in 40 rural locations in New Zealand, with the goal being to upskill health professionals in those areas in suicide prevention. And the Ministry of Primary Industries used their $250,000 to contract Dairy NZ to extend the rural support trust activities throughout New Zealand. And one of my fellow presenters will talk more about the activities in one particular region, which illustrate the impact of that response.
Excuse me, Annette, can you just put your slides up on the screen, please? We can't see them.
Oh.
You just need, there we go. Thank you.
Right, so sorry. I would just like to comment on some of the current misperceptions around what the issue really is. People are concerned about the issue of rural suicide, but the terms rural suicide and farmer suicide have tended to be used over the last year as if they were interchangeable. And of course the vast majority of suicides that occur in rural regions are not farmers. But I think with the best will in the world, a number of rural journalists in trying to convey what help might be available to farmers who might be stressed by the current economic and weather events, have tended to provide that information, but with a headline around the issue of farmer suicide. So we would like to emphasize that we're concerned about rural suicides, of which farmer suicides are a part. The second misperception is that there is an assumption, it's a assumption that if we're talking about farmer suicides, we're talking about dairy farmer suicides. And we actually don't know, we don't have enough data to be able to say that any suicides that are occurring are actually occurring in that particular area of agriculture. So we need more research and more information. But the other assumption that is being made is that if we're talking about rural suicide, we're talking about farmer suicide. If we're talking about farmer suicide, it's dairy farmer suicide, and it's dairy farm owner suicide. And we also don't have enough information to make that assumption either. And in fact, in other areas of suicide research, when we look at occupational skill level, it is very often the people within any occupation who are the least skilled, lowest socioeconomic status, least education, who are most at risk. And that is again an area in which we need good research data in order to know to which group within the farming industry we need to target our suicide prevention activities. For example, it may be that it is farm labourers, farm managers, share milkers who may be more at risk than farm owners. And the final thing I'd like to say is that any concerns around farm economic events have an impact on an entire rural community, and so we are concerned about rural contractors, rural service providers, and other people who are impacted by these events. So moving on, I want to talk now about suicide in rural areas. And we know that suicide rates are higher in rural as opposed to urban areas, and in Australia, of course, they're higher again in the remote rural areas. But people often make the assumption that it's the place, the rurality, which contributes to the risk. And what is very important to understand is that it's a matter of both people and place. And the most significant risk factors may not be area factors which relate to location, but rather those that relate to other characteristics which are shared by people who live in rural areas. So some of the risk factors for suicide in rural areas are firstly the geographic and interpersonal isolation, which often lead to a culture of self-reliance and to a culture of independence and stoicism and pride and privacy, which mitigate against getting help, particularly for mental health problems, for stress and depression. Other risk factors include low socioeconomic status and poverty, and it's important to recognise that many people in rural areas, or some people in rural areas, may choose to move there because they have limited financial resources, and rental accommodation, for example, may be cheaper. There's also a lack of jobs and a lack of career opportunities. There's limited access to healthcare and especially to mental health services in rural areas. There have been significant changes in farming, particularly in terms of the viability of smaller farms. The other issues around farming relate to the uncontrollable aspects of farming, weather events, worldwide economic events, the unfairness of some of those which impact on people working throughout the rural sector. There have also been significant job losses in rural areas as a consequence of some of the changes in farming practices. And there's also been significant losses of social support in rural areas. For example, in New Zealand, recent changes in the drink driving laws have contributed towards two problems. One is that people are more likely to drink at home because they are concerned about the risk of a drink driving charge and losing their licence, which is critically important in terms of maintaining independence and job security in a rural area. But also we know that when people drink at home, they're more likely to drink more. But the second impact is in terms of the viability of rural pubs. And in many areas of New Zealand, those pubs are no longer viable and they've closed. And that it means that a significant opportunity for social focus and social contact and social support has now been removed. And that's very often on top of rural areas losing their schools, again a significant social focus, and a consequent decline in the number of clergy and in support services such as district nurses. We also have an immigrant workforce in many areas in farming, and some of the people who may be most at risk there are the partners of immigrant workers who may be at home, may have poor English, may not have driving skills and licenses, and who may be significantly isolated. We're also seeing a group of young people who are raised in urban areas with no experience of being raised on a farm, living on a farm, and going lacking farm experience and going to work on farms. And for them it's often a big culture shock in terms of the hours, 11 days on, 3 days off, and I think we need to be aware of some of the stresses that they feel, particularly in terms of social isolation. There are also other changes and demands, particularly relating to regulatory demands, with changes in health and safety legislation with significant impacts on farming and rural providers, concerns around waterways, IT, accessibility, and taxes, all of which now have to, and tax demands, GST returns, all of which now have to be done online. And then we also have access to lethal means. And we know that people in rural areas are much more likely to die by gunshot, by suicide, than in urban areas. But it's not well known whether it's merely the access to that particularly lethal mean which accounts for that, or whether there are these other characteristics of rural people, predominantly men, including stoicism and reluctance to seek help, the difficulties in accessing help, which may mean they make more determined suicide attempts, and as part of that stronger determination, use more lethal methods. I want to talk a little bit about rural suicide prevention. In terms of prevention, our best opportunities are in educating the health and social service providers and community members who live in rural areas, and upskilling them, particularly in terms of suicide prevention and recognising who's at stress, who's at risk of suicide, who's depressed and who's stressed. Another issue, of course, is the recruitment and retention of staff, and looking to find smart and innovative workforce solutions and using the people who are happy to live in rural areas. We also have to focus on gun safety, clearly, and to promote individual well-being and protective factors. In terms of intervention, it's a challenge in rural areas to provide services which are available at all in terms of providers, accessible at times that are convenient and suitable for people who are working perhaps in isolated areas, for people who can't leave a farm during the daytime, that they're acceptable, and maybe this is where we need to look at using telehealth and online various forms of online therapy and apps, cell phone apps. And we also need to consider the affordability. As I say, some of the people living in rural areas are going to have significantly poor financial resources. In terms of systems of care, we know that collaborative care models looking at the integration of general health, primary care and mental health services are effective, and it's a matter of how we better integrate those services. And of course, in many rural areas, primary care services, the local GP is doing a great deal of the provision of mental health services, supported by the nursing staff. We also need to enhance natural supports in rural areas, family and whānau supports, clergy, the police, the rural support trust workers, and the rural service providers who often go onto the farm on a regular basis and may be some of the best contacts that people on farms have. And then of course we also need to look at the problems around crisis services and the provision, how we provide crisis services adequately in geographically often wide rural areas. So I would now like to talk about mental health services specifically in rural communities, and just reiterate that rural communities are not always idyllic, that there may be a lot of poverty, substance use and violence, and that there may be difficulties in accessing education, in accessing transport and healthcare and mental health services themselves. The challenges include a lack of providers, particularly in terms of, say, child and adolescent psychiatry or psychiatry itself. Distance is a challenge. Children, for example, adolescents will have to rely on their parents for transport, and often the time and costs of travelling to specialist mental health services mean that people have to take a day or two off work. Confidentiality is a particular issue around mental health services, maintaining privacy in a small town where everyone knows everyone else is difficult, and many people may choose to travel 5 or 6 or more hours to a different centre to discuss personal issues. And stigma, it may be particularly problematic in rural areas with a macho and stoical culture, if you like. For people with mental health services, it may also be difficult for adolescents who may be gay, lesbian, or having mental health problems in adolescents in particular. Some of these potential solutions in these areas are, again, integrated care, using meta systems and integrating mental health services into primary care services. Using technology more extensively. In New Zealand we have a rural-focused, urban-based service where using telehealth, rural providers, mental health service or health providers can access an urban-based specialist who has an acknowledged interest in providing services to rural areas and an appreciation of the difficulties. But we can also, in terms of technology, make better use of apps, text messaging, social network sites. Schools in rural areas are often a focus, maybe one of the few remaining opportunities to focus services in rural areas. So school-based programs are economical and feasible, and school-linked programs accordingly similarly are also appropriate. And again, we need a prevention focus, positive youth development, and for adults and older adults, a focus on positive mental health and well-being. So looking very briefly at the current state of rural mental health services in rural New Zealand, about 13% of the population live in rural areas now. We're a highly urbanised country, but the primary sector, in terms of the agricultural and extractive industries, contributes more than 50% of total export earnings, and that doesn't take into account tourism, and tourism is very often conducted in rural areas. We have no national framework for mental health services. We don't have a national framework for rural health services, and we don't have even a national framework for public policy in rural areas. Despite all of the recognised challenges, some of which I've just covered. And despite these recurrent themes in terms of providing rural healthcare and rural mental health services, that there's an increasing need and demand for these services, there are limited resources. The average age of a rural general practitioner in New Zealand is 60 years, and many rural practices are now maintained long-term with locums who may stay a week or a few weeks or at most a few months. There are widespread workforce shortages, both in terms of health, general health care and mental health services in rural areas. There are a number of geographic and cultural challenges. There's a lack of specific training in mental health services and suicide prevention. Many people are making absolutely heroic efforts. Many nurses and nurse specialists in rural areas are taking on mental health services, but without specific training in these areas. They're wearing several hats and stitching together services for local communities, often doing extremely well, but they could benefit from specific training in mental health services. But there's also a lack of specific training in the provision of rural health and mental health services. And the other recurrent theme is the imposition of urban models of healthcare on rural areas. It's often not a good fit, and they're imposed by policymakers who live in urban areas. And all of these impact on mental health stresses and the ability to receive care in rural areas. In terms of future directions, we have currently a very limited basis of research data for rural mental health, and we really do need to expand that to provide an evidence base for rural practice, and our health services are supposed to be evidence-based, but there is remarkably little data, at least in New Zealand, regarding mental health in rural areas. We need very clearly long-term, data-driven, united and consistent advocacy to policymakers around the needs for mental health services in rural areas. We do have two current opportunities, and I can only speak for New Zealand in this regard, but the Rural Health Alliance is currently working on developing a framework to improve mental health outcomes for rural New Zealanders, and the New Zealand Suicide Prevention Strategy, which is currently being revised. The Ministry of Health has said that one of the 4 areas of focus in this current revision of the strategy will be on rural issues, and that is clearly because of the current concerns around farmer and rural suicide. So that's my allocation of time. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to take any questions or for people to contact me via email if they have specific questions they want to ask me. Thank you.
Thank you, Annette. That was great, and I think has really set the scene for our next presenter. We do have one question, which was from Tracy, who wanted to know about what strategy is either in place or being considered to provide nurses and GPs with suicide-specific training.
Currently, as part of the emergency response, we have just completed 40 workshops in rural New Zealand, specifically about suicide prevention, and they were for nurses and GPs in particular, but also allied health professionals. We had a lot of pharmacists attend, and they were opened up to anyone else in the community with an interest, so clergy, police, who are often involved in mental health services and with mental health patients, for example. That's what we've just completed, and hopefully we are hoping for some funding in the next budget round to be able to build on that. We had many indications from people who attended these workshops, probably almost 900 people in total, that what they would really value, we were able to give an introduction. What they would like us to do is to go back and give them some more clinically focused skills. So specific education around, for example, when to reassess, safety planning, those suicide clusters and contagion, which we know are more likely to occur in rural areas. We would very much like to do that, but it's dependent on funding.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you again, Annette, for your presentation. Our next presenter is Marcia Porini, from the coordinator of Taranaki Rural Support Trust in New Zealand, who will be presenting on coordinating a response to the calls for help from dairy farmers with rural supporters around the region.
Thank you very much. Can you see my slideshow, Megan?
You should now have the button. We can, thank you.
Yes.
So thank you to the Pan Pacific Safe Communities Network for the opportunity to share the work being performed by the Taranaki Rural Support Trust. My name is Marcia Poldeni and I come from 26 years as a public service manager to the trustee of the trust, and then I resigned in April 2015 to take on a more active role as coordinator. I thought it was, first of all, I'll apologise that Dr. Annette may have said, but I just thought I'd like to show you, using an Australian quote, where the hell are we? So our region covers 2,300 square kilometres, and you can see it there on the west coast of the North Island in the centre slide. We had 110,000 people, with 75 in the New Plymouth Council, 9,000 in Stratford and 26,000 in South Taranaki. The Trust supports the rural communities within these 3 district councils, and we have rural facilitators in each of the identified smaller communities around the region. But in order to give you a bit of context about why we play the role we do, I'd like to talk a little bit more about agriculture throughout this presentation. The agricultural economy on the right-hand slide is very much dictated by the geology of the land, with the green ring plains being fertile and great for dairy farming, while the rocky darker colour there on the east is the home to sheep and beef farmers, forestry and bees. The Taranaki Basin supports oil and gas exploration that contributes about $5 billion to New Zealand economy in years gone by. The Taranaki region is dwarfed most perfect volcanic cone, Mount Taranaki, which stands at 2,518 metres, and apart from the normal winter sports, the National Park has 300 kilometres of walking tracks. The biggest attraction and population retention factor in the region is the very short drive from the mountain to the surf. And we have a surf highway that rolls around the coast, making it a place like no other, and the isolation of the west coast of the North Island, even though it's highly accessible by air, land or sea, it's also just far enough away. Taranaki's produce stems from white and black gold, and of course the white gold is milk, where 60% of the region, through 1,800 dairy farms carrying 500,000 cows, which is about 10% of New Zealand numbers, produces 12% of New Zealand's total milk. It's very intensive farming. On the hill country, the sheep and beef farmers carry about 100,000 beef stock and 400,000 sheep. But also on the hill country is 28,000 hectares of exotic forest that's milled and shipped out of our port, and our port is the 3rd largest in New Zealand. Black gold is of course oil and gas, and it's been the blood running through the veins of our region for over a century. But like all industry, it's cyclical, and the oil and gas prices has recently brought the industry to its knees. Taranaki businesses have been looking to diversify using their oil and gas expertise, and one of the examples is Fitzroy Engineering, where they're building have built an underwater restaurant for a resort in the Maldives. But there hasn't been a golden bullet found to fix Taranaki's economic woes. Some farmers, mainly in the hill country, are diversifying into beekeeping, and they're exporting or planning to export high volumes of the manuka honey to China, meeting the growing medicinal and cosmetic markets. Climate, well, Mount Taranaki is very exposed and lies in the path of weather systems coming across the Tasman Sea from Australia. So thanks very much to all of those Australians over there. The fertile ring plain receives about 1,400 millimetres annually, but the summit of the mountain receives around 7,500, and that flows down the 300 rivers across the fertile plain to the sea. My top slide on the right there shows very heavy rains causing major flooding and hill country damage in June 2015. Farmers woke to find their forestry debris taking out bridges, leaving them with no access to either their home or their farm. All good grazing pasture along the river's edge covered up with about 3 metres of silt on average. And erosion in the hill country from the rain saw a very high percentage of not only productive land buried under slips, but also stock was also buried, and the losses of stock were quite high. The Trust provided a multi-pronged support through one-on-one connections, social events and technical events in both the North, Central and South Taranaki areas. The technical events included sustainable actions and technical information that would mitigate any impact from the next event, and they were well attended by farmers in the area. We had tornadoes in June 2011, and then a month later a once-in-a-generation polar blast event forced farmers to move their stock indoors. We've had drought for 9 months of 2000, and in 2014 we recorded the warmest winter ever, and this year there's been a hot summer and winter. Winters come 6 weeks later this year, so who doesn't believe in climate change? We've had a bit of rain in March, but that introduced another farming stress, and that was another one that can't be controlled, and that was facial eczema. Bad spore count usually registers at 20,000, but that paled by counts as high as 8 million around the coast. And this all added stress to an already exposed stress with the low dairy payout and our drought conditions. So all in all, a perfect storm for dairy and sheep and beef farmers. The Rural Support Trust in Taranaki is one of 14 in New Zealand established in 2007 by the then Minister of Agriculture. It was to assist rural folk in times of a government-declared climatic adverse event. The criteria for this is set and includes the magnitude of the event, the likelihood and scale of the physical impact, and also the capacity of the community to cope economically and socially. If the region meets the criteria, such as we did in the June 2015 storm, then the funding is triggered by the Ministry of Primary Industries, a government agency that looks after primary industries in New Zealand. In peacetime, we rely on donations, sponsorship and grants. The Trust was very, very fortunate to be the recipient of a charity cycle ride where 28 cyclists rode the South Island from the top of the South Island down to the bottom, and we received 160,000 from that ride, which was in February last year. This year, the crazy idiots went and did it again, and they did the North Island this time, riding from Cape Reinga right up the top, over to the Mount Taranaki Cape, and then down to the bottom of the North Island at Cape Wellington. They raised a 25,000 for us, but also another 80,000 for a couple of other charities. Amazing effort. Dairy New Zealand and Ministry of Health, and Dr. Annette talked about this, they've also boosted the Trust's funding this year to meet dairy farmers' psychological need with the low payout. In peace times, my role is to share the Trust stories and network with like-minded organisations such as New Plymouth Injury Safe, the District Health Board Suicide Prevention and Postvention Group, Supporting Families in Mental Health, Victim Support and Family Works. There's also a lot of collaboration among rural organisations of Federated Farmers, Dairy New Zealand, Beef and Lamb, Farmlands and FNG Insurance to get together and provide information in the community of support and resources available, particularly to those isolated members of the rural communities who don't have the same access as those living in the city. Dr. Annette's touched on the suicides not good in Taranaki, so the goal is to communicate to all rural organisations about the Trust and the work of our rural facilitators. These are either rural professionals or farmers helping farmers, people who understand the challenges of rural life. The Trust has approximately 60 rural facilitators on our books, and they're identified farmers and their families who are ready and waiting to respond to the next drought, flood, cyclone or eruption. And so those are adverse event rural facilitators. In peacetime, we have another 27 who have got skills to support, skills relating to mental health and suicide, victim support skills, first responder or ambulance drivers, or practice nurses. They have supported us in helping 105 families who have cried out for help since the 1st of July last year. Our motto is big ears and small mouth, and the climate and the high incidence of facial eczema and the $5 drop in dairy income since August 2015 shows that we're still in for a long ride as the low payout is expected to continue due to the European and US production levels on the global trading market. Operationally, my role as coordinator is to take the inbound call or referral, sometimes from a rural professional like an accountant or a banker, but sometimes also from family members. And I allocate that client to a rural facilitator who lives nearby and keep in touch with them as part of keeping them safe. We debrief and identify training and resource needs and encourage them at every opportunity to elevate trust visibility in their communities so the barriers for those seeking help are removed, and my ambitious goal of no more suicides in Taranaki under my watch might be realised. Dr. Annette, vibrant and active rural communities fast disappearing. In the Taranaki, it's due to farmers with capital buying small farms around them as they come up for sale, rural cheese factories being gobbled up by, I don't want to say it, but Fonterra, community stores closing because of lack of patronage, local hotels, schools and bowling clubs. These were the places that offered a social connection, and I witnessed them closing probably 6 monthly. Access to services is getting harder for rural farmers and their families. Some of them are unable to see a doctor for 3 weeks if they are taking on new patients at their clinic, or even if there's a practice in the community. Last week, another rural medical centre around the coast closed. Only 1% of the GP graduates stay in New Zealand, I've been told, and the dilemma for rural communities is how do we attract them into a rural practice. The rural demands mean farmers work, live on their farm 24/7. They can't leave at 5 o'clock and forget about their business. The trustees did an exercise where we identified 47 stress factors across 14 categories that only farmers face. Urban people have little knowledge of the true nature of farming stress, and this adds to the societal self-stigma. Farmers with low self-esteem, reduced confidence and shame means they won't put their hands up for help. And the pressure on those who may need to help drives them deeper into social isolation, depression and suicide. The strong men carrying on is portrayed by our national and our local rugby teams, and a local clothing company logo of Taranaki Hardcore is portrayed, does not soften the messages of toughen it up or harden up. We recently had New Zealand comedian Mike King and ex-All Black Sir John Kirwan visit to dispel myths, create discussion and share their stories about their depression journeys. Both had huge audiences that were engaged, and the buzz afterwards led us to believe this was the beginning of a culture shift, and we do intend to try and work with partners to get them both back into Taranaki. Rural suicide statistics and lack of information for the rural community prompted our trust to follow Southland's lead and co-produce 15,000 copies of a newspaper called Feeling Down on the Farm. It was distributed to GP clinics and everyone and everything rural. It won the Print Media Prize at the 2014 Australian Mental Health Services Awards, so it's a publication to be very proud of and one that we aim to reproduce in 2017. There's also talk among suicide prevention groups to do one for urban folk. My previous slides referred to Feeling Down on the Farm, and while the government through the Ministry of Health, MPI, are funding to enable the Trust to respond to the calls for help, I feel compelled to use this opportunity to share the lack of real investment by the government to improve suicide statistics. The graph on the left shows the number of suicides and the drop in them from 2008. The total government road safety investment since 2012 and 13 has been about 540 to 700 million per year. This has seen adjustments to alcohol limits, hard-hitting public awareness campaigns and targeted enforcement such as compulsory breath testing, speed cameras, etc. And it's steadily dropped and remained less than 300 since 2008. The annual suicide figure of 500 in New Zealand has been static since 2008. In Labour weekend, October 2014, 4 people died on the road, but there was silence for the 11 who died by suicide in that same weekend. Dr. Annette talked about rural suicide and Taranaki suicide. As you can see, at 13.5 for every 100,000 people is a lot higher than the national figure of 11.6. Chart shows New Zealand farmers over 8 years, 200 of them have committed suicide, and the age for farmers committing nationally is between 20 and 65-year-old males. The police responded in the 12 months ending May 15 to 518 attempted suicides in Taranaki. And of the 19 suicides, we know 7 were farmers. So the rural figures, of course, are an interest to the Rural Support Trust to carry on the work that we're doing. 2005 cost of suicide paper by O'Day and Tucker puts the cost for Taranaki for that 12-month period at 47.5 million. And when I use the national suicides of 569 in the same year, the cost is 1,500 million. While the Trust Coordinator role is to support the welfare of rural community in Taranaki, the stigma is holding back open discussions within our communities about good mental health and enabling people to call out for help. Then it's also the societal stigma that is blinding the Ministry of Health for more and the government for more mental health funding. Suicide continues to operate in shadows, silence and shame. So why don't we, last week we had an event at a local hall 50 kilometres up a valley and with lunch. So I thought farmers would come out. It's a quiet time for the sheep and beefies at the moment, but only 5 out of a possible 30 attended. The Trust is concerned about the continued isolation in these communities by rural farming males, and whether they're camouflaging their illness with alcohol instances, we still need to keep creating events to capture their hearts and minds. We need farming communities to learn what to say and how to talk about good and bad mental health and to understand options and where resources are. Good Yarn is a workbook designed by Lindsay Wright. He's a coordinator for the Southland Rural Support Trust, and after 42 years dairy farming fell into depression. He looked for resources, but there was nothing around for rural. So with supported research from Well South District Health Board, he adapted a full-day product called Mental Health 101 down to about 3 hours and gave it a rural perspective. In our goal of creating events that will raise awareness, the Rural Support Trust has purchased a 2-year licence to run 60 stress mental health workshops across the region. The audience is rural professionals and all others serving and living in the rural community who want to learn how to recognise, respond while still maintaining their safety. We've had 3 workshops so far in Taranaki with 27 participants, and they've given great feedback, including they wish more farmers were present as they know how grim it is out there. Our goal is to reduce the stigma and the discrimination and to encourage people to seek help, or at a minimum to talk to someone, anyone. So we'll persevere and get into those isolated communities, and even if one person turns up and they save a life, it will be worth it. Thank you for your consideration today. I've enjoyed sharing the story of the Taranaki Rural Support Trust and apologise for inserting my political views, which are not part of my role or my contract, but they do make me angry and I wanted to share. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Marcia. That was a really interesting presentation and extremely topical for Australian dairy farmers at the moment as well. We don't have any questions for you at this time, so I would encourage everyone to get the email address, and if you do have a question of Marcia and of the program, that you contact her directly. So we'll go on to our final presenter for today, who is Tracy McCown. She's the Manager of Lived Experience Network at Suicide Prevention Australia, and Tracy's going to be presenting on the Communities Matter Toolkit.
My button. Yep. Thanks,
Great.
everyone.
Thank you.
Again, a big thanks to the Australian Safe Communities Foundation for hosting the webinar and for inviting Suicide Prevention to participate. And it's been very enlightening to be able to listen to both Annette and to Marcia. And it is frighteningly amazing how very similar a lot of our statistics are and our challenges for our rural, remote, and I would include regional. So I'm going to start today though by acknowledging all those that we have lost to suicide. We acknowledge the suffering that suicide brings when it touches our lives. And we very much believe that we're brought together by that experience, but we are unified by hope. And I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of country throughout here in Australia, their continuing connections to land, sea and community, and we pay our respects to them and their cultures and to elders past and present. So from my perspective, I am an individual who is bereaved by the death of a schoolmate, and as well I have a current individual in my family who are struggling a lot. This is a very passionate topic for me. And I very much came into this space as a person who is very empathetic and care deeply about people and the communities that we live in. And so I'm very inspired to be able to be here with you today and to generally work in this space. So suicide prevention has a description of lived experience of suicide, which is very open, very inclusive, and that is somebody who's experienced either suicidal thoughts, they've survived a suicide attempt, they may have cared for someone who has attempted a suicide or may even have just gone through very strong suicidal ideation periods. They're bereaved by suicide, or we include this last statement of having been touched by suicide in some other way to acknowledge the diverse ways that suicide impacts someone's way of thinking, living, and reacting to life. And so when we talk about all those persons who fit any of these ways of identifying as having lived experience, they are part of our community. So anytime we talk about community, it's not talking of those outside of this group. It includes all of those who identify with lived experience. But at the same time, when we talk about these greater communities, which with both Annette and Marcy have covered so well, it is those social groups and the challenges that we just heard about very clearly because of the isolation and various other topics, specific localities again. But for communities, it might be the more regional who do have more services, but it's still a specific locality. Cultural, that's a really broad topic, especially now as our world is changing continually with the number of different types of individuals that come to live in each of our countries based on either just the global capacity to live and work in a different place or the strife that our world's going through. Of course, we all spend a lot of time in our workplaces if we are honored enough to have good work. Our religious and spiritual spaces are important areas of community, and then that larger group of population who, for various reasons, are quite marginalized. So all of these people are part of our community, and as we move forward into this discussion of communities matter, all of these people matter, and it's just critical that we bring those voices to the table. So the Communities Matter Toolkit is literally an online toolkit. It's accessible anywhere that there is an internet access, and it is to help a community who need to make some changes, want to make changes, to have some tools to start to make that happen. But I do need to make sure I acknowledge the support that we received to create this toolkit, and that was through the Mental Health Commission of New South Wales. But there were also some other really important organizations, and it was really lovely to hear Marcia talking about the fundraising that has happened, because some of the fundraising that occurred came through the Canterbury League Club as part of their programs, as well as a group called the PPP for SPA. That's an annual event, 24-hour treadmill challenge that happens in various locations across Australia. And they contributed significantly to the development of this toolkit, along with actual organizations and communities who were struggling. So when we say, why did we develop a toolkit, one of the things that we were experiencing in this office literally were communities that were very remote, rural, were calling us. They had experienced far too many deaths by suicide and just needed to do something and just didn't know where to start. And from our perspective at Suicide Prevention Australia, we recognise that really the government and national organisations have a big role to play, but in the end we also need to be able to provide communities with capacity building, and the understanding of what they too can do to drive community change at that level. So as I move forward now, I'm actually going to be talking directly in relation to what's on the Communities Matter Toolkit, but without going into too much detail. So in the middle circle on this image is Start a Group, and that's one of the menu items. So the website itself is very minimalistic on the menu items to keep it quite straightforward. And so within this space, it will cover concepts that would often arise in the early stages of a community trying to start some kind of an action network, an action group. And like one of the topics that's on that page is considering how are you going to structure your group, because we know that that can both be quite challenging, oftentimes confusing, and there are very specific tools that might help you do that, as well as all of the other topics around that circle. Everything from writing an action plan might be completely foreign for someone who works and lives in a rural area. So there's very much little tips and even often some downloadable templates to assist with all of these items. And another one of the menu items is run a group. So that's kind of that movement between we started a group, but how do we keep that group going? What are the types of things that we should be considering to do, and how do we actually move forward to make them happen? And something that I heard a lot, and it was very, again, the crossover between the countries is appropriate, and that's that need to bring more training in community, especially communities who don't have the depth of services that exist in a larger metropolitan area. Because in the end, we all have the ability to help each other. We may still need quite high-level professional care at times, and this doesn't try to fix that. But there are a lot of early intervention, early preventions that we as individuals can still do. So in this space, we talk about training our local people. We want to seek leaders in the community. That doesn't mean they actually carry a specific role in a council. They're a leader in the sense of who they are, their passion, their capacity to garner a greater set of voices and ears to hear and learn what we need to do. And I really liked the idea that Marcia was talking about, you know, I can't remember your exact words, but it was around listen more, talk less. The power of words can make a real difference, and that comes through in that training as well. And then a fairly sensitive space often is around the media and what happens with the media when there is a death. We do know that we need to be able to communicate, but we need to communicate in a way that doesn't trigger someone who is struggling. It also doesn't cause trauma for those who are recently bereaved or were traumatized by the actual death. And there is a link to some excellent media guidelines that are based here in Australia, and they are very much evidence-based. One of the spaces is, you know, that it's really good to know what each other are doing, different groups right across the country, and we felt that was a really important part, because as we brought communities together to help us create this, that's what they really found very, very helpful, because again, those who live in hard, rural, distant areas understand each other. They are different from us, such as myself, who live in a very metropolitan area. So there's the opportunity to learn more. And so one of the examples that's available on the website, and there's several, is a community called Hay. Hay is a community of about 3,000 people. They are in a rural farming area, so they're 100 kilometers from the nearest center, a large center, and they created what's called the Community Action for Suicide Elimination, so the acronym of CASE. And it was formed in 2011 because of the large number of suicides that were occurring. They came together as a result of a public meeting, it was called, as they began to have these discussions, and they had things that we talked about. The community leaders, the town mayor was very passionate, and he was very much on board. So you can learn more about what they've done. There's numerous other case studies. There's some downloadable documents that they have provided quite specifically. And this is also a space that you can also contribute. So if you've got your own community groups that are doing good work and you believe that others can learn from what you have managed to do, there is an online email contact that you can send that information to so that it can be shared with the world. Together we can make some of these changes that come through. Now, an important part of the website is around help seeking. Now, in this one on the website, it says Help Myself. The Help Myself is for those who are struggling, and I've just popped in some very high-level little concepts. Somebody might just simply by thinking that they're not really coping, that if they find the link to either this or, as was discussed earlier, the many other technology options, that hopefully they'll reach out for it. Lost my job, or sometimes it's around depression and other mental challenges and they're just struggling to move. So this particular page will have a range of Australian options, so to be really good for any local community group to create a help seeking that's very much locally based, as well as providing in New Zealand your national hotlines and things like that. There's another menu item though that is more about how do we as the individuals in that community know how to help someone else. And this comes back mostly to self-educating, or if you get the opportunity to do some formalized training. There is the ASSIST course and things like that that are internationally run. Mental health first aid, that's internationally run. I'm making an assumption that they would also be available in Australia. And those are outstanding courses to get your leaders, your movers and shakers, and then begin at that top. It's something that we usually do in the corporate world. You get the people at the top to lead the change and let it then be taken to all of the other individuals who are empowered and capable of creating change. So on this tab, it'll just again provide some information that can help as we think about that. And one of the big things that's available again for absolutely anyone wherever you are is called conversationsmatter.com.au. So conversationsmatters.com.au is a place where an individual, whether they be a clinical person, a professional person, or a member of the community, can learn a little bit more about how you talk about suicide, how you ask the question, why you should, and also can help break down some of the myths. So on the website itself, communitiesmatter.com.au, there's also quite a few of these things around the do's and don'ts, myths and facts, and as well as the warning signs and risk factors. There may not be quite specific to the rural farming sectors that were spoken about today, but they're still quite relevant. And those are also all downloadable in a PDF format. And there's also some great fact sheets. They're all quite good for the general community, but really important for that local community who are trying to set something up, and especially if they want to be able to do some evaluation and it's something that's just foreign to them, they've never done these things. There's some tools and some templates with a goal to that assisting people to make those extra steps, because we actually know that when there are some programs in place, if they've had some evaluation, it's a little easier to get funding to keep them going. And so we really encourage individuals to look at tools to do evaluation, and if the templates aren't enough, reach out to your local universities and see if you can get some PhD students that can jump on board and help you as you continue to deliver your existing programs. So overall, the key message that we would put out there is around collaborating. We want to see our local communities bring together the leaders who then bring more people along, involve diverse local people, and on that one I really want to focus on the fact that we need to ensure that people with what we call lived experience of suicide are actively involved, and in a diverse way, in the sense that we want anyone who, it's really important to have people who've actually attempted suicide as well as had suicidal thoughts. The bereaved often are strong voices that start these programs, but let's bring in the others. We have a lot to learn from people who've come through and are doing well now, and we need to hear their voices. And through collaborating, which is what Suicide Prevention Australia does here, and our role is to collaborate with the other organisations in the suicide and mental health sector, as well as local and federal governments, to change the way services are delivered, create educational opportunities, and empower individuals to make a difference in their community. And so if you take nothing else away, we just hope that you would take a chance to go out and have a look at the actual website itself, communitiesmatter.com.au. Have a read through it, see if it starts to work for you, if there's anything that resonates for you and your community. It's all there to be shaped and used to the way that suits you. And we would really love to know if you have already checked out the website, or if you do sometime after this webinar. We'd love to hear from you. My details are on the screen at the moment, and I'm happy to answer any questions that may arise either now or later. And thank again so much for allowing us to present communitiesmatter.com.au.
Thanks, Tracy. It was great to round out the webinar with some practical tools and resources for communities to be able to access. It doesn't look like we have any questions for you now, so we will leave it to people to contact you directly. So on behalf of all of the participants, I wanted to thank all of our presenters today. As I said, please feel free to email the presenters with any follow-up questions that you may have. Just a reminder that the webinar is being recorded and will be available early next week, and please feel free to share it with any of your colleagues and networks. Our next webinar will be on road safety and will be held on Thursday the 18th of August. The speaker details will be circulated closer to the event. And again, we encourage you to complete the survey at the end of the session, or which is in the follow-up email. Please continue to let us know the topics that you find most useful for your roles. And finally, thank you to all the participants for being a part of this webinar today. Enjoy the rest of your day.